Jared Diamond. Welcome to TMTPOST and watch my speech for T-EDGE X One World in Tech. Come here to join me in discussing how can we turn today's COVID crisis into an opportunity. Please join me.
Please, we are listening.
This crisis, believe it or not, is an opportunity. This COVID crisis is an opportunity to change our world for the better. And when I say that, right away, a voice inside me says, what an awful idea to suggest that something so terrible as COVID could change our world for the better. Here we have a tragedy that has already killed hundreds of thousands of people, that has infected millions of people around the world, that is clobbering our economies around the world, that is changing our social relationships. I myself am very aware of the suffering caused by COVID. First of all, COVID has cut off our personal relationships. My wife and I have not been able to receive friends in our house. We've not been able to visit friends. But I personally would be the last person to deny that COVID is a tragedy, because in the last 3 weeks, my wife and I have lost 5 of our closest, longest friends due to disease. One just the day before yesterday, another last Friday, one of my closest friends in Europe. We've lost 5 or 6 of our closest friends of long standing. And so I would be the last person to deny the tragedy of COVID. What could be good about this tragedy? But let's think about what the world is going to be like next year when we have developed vaccines, when we've gotten through the immediate crisis. How will the COVID crisis have changed us? And I'm going to show you reasons for optimism. I'm going to tell you that the COVID crisis really may change the world for the better. COVID is a crisis. I'm interested in crises. My recent book, Upheaval, was about national crises. I was motivated to write my book about national crises by 2 things. One is that when I reflect on the countries where I've lived during my 82 years of life, and the countries that I know best, that I keep visiting, and where I have friends, countries that I've lived in for several years, countries that I've known for 60 years. All of the countries that I know well have either undergone a crisis or were undergoing a crisis or were about to undergo a crisis when I lived there. For example, I was living in Germany on the day that the Berlin Wall was erected. I first visited Chile shortly before the terrible 1973 coup d'etat in Chile. I first visited Finland in the aftermath of Finland's severe national crisis, its war against the overwhelmingly powerful Soviet Union. I began working in Australia at the time of Australia's slowly dealing with its slowly unfolding crisis, Australia gradually coming to grips with its White Australia policy. And I began working in Indonesia a short time after Indonesia's explosion of 1965. So as I've reflected on the countries that I know best, they've all experienced or were experiencing or about to experience crises. There's a saying, correlation does not prove causation. If some things happen together, that doesn't prove that they're a cause. You might think Jared Diamond's living in a country causes a crisis. No, that's not the case. It's instead that all countries undergo crises, and it's just that the countries that I know best have had their share of crises. And so I'm interested in national crises. I've wondered, can we learn something from the national crises of the recent past that would help us in solving the national crises and the world crisis that we're facing at present? But there's another reason why I'm interested in crises, And that has to do with the work of my wife, Marie, a clinical psychologist. Marie and I met 42 years ago in the year 1978. And we began dating and we got married. In the first year of our marriage, Marie, a clinical psychologist, did a specialty training in an area of psychotherapy called crisis therapy. Most psychotherapy, most psychology, most psychiatry aims to help people with long-term problems that unfold slowly. And so a person may see a psychologist every week for several years. But think of a person encountering a sudden crisis. And I'm sure every one of you has encountered a personal crisis. Or if not, you certainly know people who've encountered a personal crisis. The personal crises are ones that we all know about. A personal crisis may arise from the breakup of one's marriage or a close relationship. A personal crisis may arise from the death of a loved one, the death of your spouse, your parent, your child, making you question whether the world is a fair place. A crisis may arise from a setback to your job or a setback to your health. These are all examples of personal crises. Marie and her fellow therapist, when I met Marie, were working in an area of psychotherapy called crisis therapy, in which someone comes in with a crisis. Their marriage is just breaking up, and that person needs help fast. You cannot spend several years trying to help them. They're very upset. Maybe they'll even commit suicide unless you can help them. And so each week, Marie and her fellow therapists discussed in the office, all the patients in the office, discussed how the patients were doing, and asked themselves what patients are succeeding in working through with their crises and what patients are not doing well with their crises. Marie and her fellow therapists perceived what they call outcome predictors. They recognized a dozen factors that make it more or less likely that a person will resolve a personal crisis. And as Marie told me about these outcome predictors for personal crises, I realized similar factors also serve as outcome predictors for national crises. Some countries resolve their crises better than others, and the reasons, the factors, are similar to the factors involved in the outcomes of personal crises. Just to give you some examples, all of you, by experience, who've experienced a personal crisis, you have recognized the factors that make it easier for a person to get through a personal crisis, or that make it impossible for a person to resolve a personal crisis. You know from experience that if you're in a crisis, if your marriage is broken up, if you have just been fired from your job, the first thing you have to do is to acknowledge that you're in a crisis. If you deny that you're in a crisis, if you don't acknowledge the crisis, then of course you make no progress towards resolving it. But nations too. Nations may acknowledge or they may deny that they're facing a crisis. And a nation that denies that it is facing a national crisis, of course, will not make any progress towards resolving it. Again, you all know from personal experience, to resolve a personal crisis, you have to accept responsibility. You have to acknowledge, I have to do something to solve this crisis myself. It's no good for you to blame other people for the crisis. If you blame other people and don't accept responsibility for yourself, then you won't make any other change and you won't resolve the crisis. But similarly, countries, you know from experience that there are countries that blame other countries and don't resolve their crisis. A prime example, Germany after World War I. Germany was defeated in World War I. At the end of World War I, Germans adopted the widespread belief that Germany lost World War I not because of its own fault, but because it was stabbed in the back by enemies and by unfaithful Germans. The fact was Germany lost World War I because of the bad political decisions by Germany's own leaders. But that denial of responsibility on Germany's part, denial of responsibility for its defeat in World War I, meant that Germany made terrible decisions in the 1920s and 1930s that resulted in the election of a Nazi government and a worse disaster for Germany, the disaster of World War II. That's something familiar, I'm sure, to all of you. Another feature of personal crises that will be familiar to all of you from experience. In a personal crisis, you have to make a change. You have to figure out what part of yourself is not working well and has to be changed. If your marriage is broken up, you have to figure out, what did I do wrong in my marriage? And what do I have to change about myself so that my next marriage or this marriage will work better? But that doesn't mean you have to change everything about yourself. In a personal crisis, change has to be selective. You have to recognize, what do I need to change and what about me is okay and can be maintained. Similarly, nations, when a nation encounters a national crisis, the country has to recognize what about the country is not working and needs changing, and what about the country is working well and does not need changing. A prime example of that was Japan in the 1800s. We're not talking about Japan today, Japan in the 1930s. We're talking about Japan from 1853 onwards in what's called the Meiji era, when Japan faced a crisis due to being exposed to the West. And Japan recognized that Japan had to make changes quickly in order to develop strength to resist the West. Japan in the 1800s, from 1853 until 1910, in what's called the Meiji era in Japanese history, is a wonderful example of selective change. Japan changed some things and didn't change other things. Japan did not change its emperor. Japan maintained its emperor. Japan did not change its writing system. Japan maintained its wonderful kanji writing system. But Japan changed its form of government, and it abandoned feudalism, and it adopted a national educational system, and it adopted industrialization. In short, Japan illustrates selective change, something familiar to all of you from personal experience with personal crises. Japan in the 1800s also illustrates the importance of getting help. Again, all of you in personal crises know the importance of getting help from friends. If you're having difficulties with your husband or your wife, it helps you to talk with friends, to get the advice of your friends about how to conduct your marriage better. It also helps to have models, to have friends whose marriages are proceeding happily. And so in resolving a personal crisis, the help from friends is important. Having friends as models is important. But similarly, nations can get help from other nations, as did Japan in the 1800s. Nations can use other nations as models for solving a crisis. Conversely, a nation that does not get help from other nations, or that refuses to look to other nations for models of resolving a crisis, those nations are not going to succeed in resolving their crisis. Again, all of you know from personal experience, to resolve a personal crisis, you have to be honest. You have to be honest about yourself. You have to be honest what about yourself you're doing well, and what about yourself you're not doing well, what you have to change. Similarly, countries, nations have to be honest. Nations have to be honest about what feature of the country is going well now and what feature of the country is not going well now. My own country, the United States, is a good example. There are things in the United States that are not going well today, and there are some Americans that refuse to acknowledge what there is in the United States that's not going well today. And then a final outcome predictor that I mentioned. In personal crises, you know the importance of confidence, self-confidence, from having resolved a personal crisis before. If you've been through a previous personal crisis and have resolved it, you then have confidence when there's a new crisis. I solved that former crisis, so I'll be able to solve this new crisis. Similarly, nations gain confidence from having solved previous crises. An example is Finland, that small European country of Finland. Finland survived its war against the Soviet Union, and because Finland survived that war, Finns at the time that I was visiting Finland had confidence. They recognized, we survived something as difficult as war against the giant Soviet Union. That gives us confidence that we can survive anything today. And when I was living in Britain, the foreign country in which I've lived the longest was Britain. I've lived there for 5 years. I lived in Britain from 1958 to 1962. And at that time, the World War was freshly in memory. My British friends remembered the Battle of Britain in 1940, when Britain alone fought off the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, in the so-called Battle of Britain. In the 1950s and 1960s, the British people still thought back to the Battle of Britain, when Britain had stood alone against Nazi Germany. And that gave the British confidence that they could solve any problem because they had solved that problem. Those are national crises, but today the world also faces world crises, beginning with COVID. COVID is a crisis for the whole world. COVID has already affected many or most of the world's countries. Any country that has not yet been affected by COVID will be affected by COVID. So COVID is a world crisis. COVID is unique. COVID is something new in world history. COVID is the first acknowledged global crisis. Even before COVID, there were problems that affected the whole world. But the world has refused to acknowledge that these were global problems. The global problems that the world has faced and is still facing include climate change and depletion of world resources. But it has not been clear to the world that climate change is a global problem requiring a global solution. Why is it that we recognize COVID as a global problem requiring a global solution? One reason is that COVID kills people quickly. If you die of COVID, there's no doubt that you died of COVID. You die of COVID within 2 or 3 days, at most 2 weeks. Whereas if you die of climate change kills people. Climate change kills people by bad air quality, or by causing starvation, or by rising sea level and causing tsunamis. But climate change doesn't kill people within 2 days, the way COVID does. Climate change doesn't kill people indisputably, the way COVID does. And so we have refused to recognize climate change as a global problem. Just compare COVID and climate change in this respect. Suppose my country, suppose the United States, selfishly decided that it would combat COVID only within the borders of the United States. Suppose the United States develops a vaccine, and suppose stupidly we use that vaccine only to vaccinate Americans, and we don't allow any other country in the world to use the vaccine to vaccinate its own people. If the United States solves COVID within its own boundaries, it's only a matter of time before the United States gets reinfected. The United States already was infected with COVID from travelers from overseas, from Europe and other places. That illustrates that the United States cannot solve COVID by itself, nor can China solve COVID by itself, nor can Italy and Germany or France solve COVID by itself. COVID is a global problem. The world is not going to be safe against COVID until the entire world is safe against COVID. So COVID is recognizable as a global problem. But reflect, COVID is not the biggest global problem. Yes, COVID is a tragedy. And I said at the beginning, I recognize COVID as a personal tragedy that recently has killed 6 of my wife's and mine closest friends. But realistically, even if everybody in the world gets infected with COVID, and even if COVID kills 2% of the world's population, 1%, 1/10 of a world percent, 1/10 of 1%, at the very worst, COVID may kill 150 million people. More likely, COVID will kill only a few million people. Only a few million people. That seems like a dreadful tragedy. But COVID kills a small number of people, whereas climate change or the nuclear risk, those have the potential for killing everybody in the world. Again, COVID is damaging our economies, but that's not going to go on forever. It's only a matter of time. Once we have a vaccine, and presumably there will be a vaccine maybe next year, maybe even the end of this year, certainly the year after next. Once we have a vaccine, then we'll be protected and the world's economy will recover. COVID is not a permanent danger to the world's economy, but climate change is a permanent danger to the world's economy. Climate change may damage the world's economy forever. That's why I say that COVID is not the biggest of the world's problems. It's a problem that focuses our attention, but there are bigger problems. What are the bigger problems? You know what the bigger problems of the world are. They are climate change, which is a problem for China, and it's a problem for the United States, and it's a problem for Europe, and it's a problem for Brazil. All countries in the world are affected by climate change, which is a problem in many ways that you know and that my country knows. Climate change causes often drought. Climate change may cause high temperatures. Climate change reduces agricultural production, and therefore climate change tends to cause starvation. Climate change causes the spread of diseases. With climate change, diseases that were formerly confined to the tropics can now spread to temperate zone countries as temperatures get warmer. And so tropical diseases such as malaria and dengue fever and cholera will spread, are spreading from the tropics to the temperate zones, spreading to temperate parts of China, but also spreading to temperate parts of the United States and spreading to temperate parts of Europe. There's a disease in tropical Africa called Chikungunya Fever. It had never been known in Europe, but because of climate change, because Europe is getting warmer, Chikungunya fever, which requires tropical conditions, has spread to Italy. That's why I say that climate change is a much more serious problem than COVID. Climate change has the potential for being with us forever and ruining our economy forever. But climate change isn't our only big problem. Another big problem is unsustainable use of world resources. All of us in the world, in China, in the United States, Europe, everywhere, we depend upon resources, resources that are present only in finite quantities: forests, fisheries, fresh water, topsoil. China, the United States have problems of soil erosion. You, as well as we, as well as Europe, depend upon imports of seafood. You and we in other countries depend upon imports of forests. But the world's forests and the world's fisheries and the world's soils are being managed unsustainably. That's a problem for the whole world. There's the problem of inequality around the world. There are rich countries and there are poor countries. Within the same country, such as the United States, there are poorer people and there are richer people. We've been seeing in the United States within the last few weeks that where there is inequality within a country, the poor people become unhappy, but in the world, there are poor countries and there are rich countries. As long as there are poor countries in the world, those poor countries have the potential for sharing their problems with richer countries, sharing their diseases that the poor country itself is not capable of solving, sharing their economic problems. And then, of course, there's the nuclear risk, the risk of the use of nuclear weapons, the exchange of nuclear weapons between any two countries due to what's called the nuclear winter can change the world's atmosphere and ruin conditions for the whole world. So in short, the world faces global problems. COVID is not our first global problem, but COVID is, ironically, although it's the least important of these global problems, COVID is the first of these global problems that the world is recognizing as a global problem. Why? Because for those reasons that I mentioned, COVID is being recognized as a global problem because COVID kills people quickly. Depletion of topsoil does not kill people quickly. COVID unequivocally kills people. If you die of COVID, there's no doubt that you died of COVID. Whereas if you die of a respiratory disease or of starvation, the background reason may be climate change, but you don't recognize that you died of climate change. So COVID, for the first time in world history, is a global problem affecting the whole world, and it's a global problem that is being recognized as a global problem. I admit there are plenty of people in the world today who do not recognize COVID as a global problem. There are people who foolishly talk about developing vaccines and using the vaccine only in their own country. But that's a bad idea, because if a country develops a vaccine and uses the vaccine only within its borders, then other countries will develop COVID and reinfect. Therefore, COVID gives us an example of a global problem requiring a global solution. Therefore, I said at the beginning that COVID, this terrible tragedy, nevertheless makes me feel cautiously optimistic. Why does this tragedy make me feel optimistic? It makes me feel optimistic because the world is in the process of recognizing that this is a global problem, and that for the first time, the whole world has to unite in solving this problem. But I mentioned earlier that one of the outcome predictors for solving personal problems and for solving national problems is previous success in solving a personal problem or in solving a national problem. Again, all of you know from experience that when a young person, a person in their teenage years or in their 20s, has a personal crisis, it may be their first personal crisis. And it's very upsetting for a young person to face their first personal crisis because they don't have experience of having resolved a personal crisis. But once you've been through a personal crisis, and then there comes another personal crisis later, you can think back and recognize, I have faced a personal crisis before and I solved it. I have confidence that I can solve a personal crisis. Because I solved that previous crisis, I can believe that I'm going to solve this new crisis. And so I'm cautiously optimistic. Next year, or the year after next, when we will have solved COVID as a joint effort on the part of the whole world, the world will have experience of having solved a global problem by a global effort. And that, I think and I hope, will then motivate the world to attack these other global problems. Until now, we have not attacked the problem of climate change as a worldwide effort. But just think about climate change. Can any one country solve the problem of climate change itself? Could the United States reduce carbon dioxide levels over the United States, clean up the atmosphere over the United States, and prevent climate change? No, of course not, because the atmosphere over the United States is mixed with the atmosphere over the whole world. The United States cannot solve climate change by itself. The United States has to join in solving climate change as a global problem. Similarly for China, suppose China could find some way of reducing carbon dioxide levels over China. Does that mean that China will protect itself against climate change? No, because the atmosphere over China is mixed with the atmosphere over India and Africa and South America. China cannot solve climate change by itself, nor can the United States solve climate change by itself. These are global problems that require global solutions. But until now, until COVID, the world has refused to recognize that we need a global approach to solving a global problem. I'm therefore cautiously optimistic that once the world has succeeded in solving COVID at the global level within the next year or two, we will then think, we solve this global problem, but we have other global problems that are more serious than COVID. We solve COVID by a global effort. Let's now solve these other problems by a global effort. And so I'm hoping, I think, I pray, I hope that COVID will inspire countries of the world after solving COVID to join in a global effort to solve the serious problems facing the world, to solve the problem of climate change, to solve the problem of resource depletion, to solve the problem of diminishing seafood levels, forest levels. And if that's the case, then this tragedy of COVID may cause our world to change for the better. That's why I'm cautiously optimistic and why I think that COVID may, in the long run, leave us with a better world.
下载大媒体 App 解锁科技商业新姿势。